Before her lay a moss-covered stone tablet, half buried in the earth, its surface etched with symbols so worn they seemed nearly swallowed by time. The air around her was heavy, still, pierced only by the distant cry of unseen birds and the faint rustle of leaves, stirred by a tentative breeze. Fingers trembling, Lena traced the curling lines of the ancient script, whispering fragments of forgotten languages under her breath. "These markings," she murmured, "they're not random. This is a language, no, a record of the people who came before." Her delicate voice barely rose above a whisper, but the weight of her words rippled through the small gathering. Evelyn approached quietly, her sharp eyes narrowing as she knelt beside Lena, the familiar determination settling over her features. "Show me," Evelyn urged softly, her usual confident tone tempered by awe. Lena lifted the tablet slightly, revealing a jagged break at its base and a scattering of smaller shards embedded in the surrounding soil. The relic felt impossibly heavy with meaning, a tangible link to the island's lost past. "They vanished," Lena said, her voice catching, "or were erased." Marcus, standing nearby, shifted uneasily. "Vanished, erased. That's just superstition. We need evidence, not stories whispered by the wind." His words were sharp, cutting through the reverent silence, and Evelyn's gaze flickered with a mixture of frustration and resolve. "We're here because the island defies our understanding," she said quietly. "Dismiss the impossible at your peril." The rest of the team gathered around a shallow pit Lena had uncovered earlier that morning. Broken pottery shards, brittle bones, and fragments of woven fabric lay scattered in the moist sand, half swallowed by creeping roots and salt-stained earth. The relics bore marks of a past civilization, one swallowed by the tides and time, forgotten by the world, and now reclaimed by the island. Dr. Ortiz stood apart, arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line, his pale face drawn tight. "Even if these are real," he argued, "it doesn't explain the psychological effects we're experiencing. This is a place that preys on the mind, not just a historical curiosity." Evelyn nodded, rubbing her temples as a wave of exhaustion washed over her. But what if it's both? What if the island's power is tied to its history, to the people it consumed? The tension between them was palpable, the fragile harmony of scientific inquiry fraying at the edges. Marcus shook his head, stepping forward. "We can't let fear cloud our judgment. We map, we record, we analyze. That's how we survive." "And what if survival means accepting things beyond analysis?" Lena's voice was steady despite the turmoil in her eyes. "If this island embodies forgotten histories, then our presence here is a disturbance. Maybe naming and remembering is our only defense." Captain Reed stood silent at the edge of the camp, his gaze fixed on the fog that rolled in from the shore like a living thing. The sea's rhythmic tides whispered a haunting lullaby, swallowing sound and light in equal measure. His weather-beaten face was unreadable, but the stoicism he wore as armor was beginning to crack beneath the weight of the island's mystery. That evening, the camp was shrouded in uneasy quiet. The relics were carefully catalogued, their presence a constant reminder of the island's enigmatic past. The scientists huddled over their notes and instruments, but beneath their professional facades, doubt gnawed at their resolve. "We're chasing shadows," Ortiz muttered to Evelyn as the last light faded from the sky. "And the more we chase, the more we lose ourselves." Evelyn's fingers hovered over her recorder before she finally pressed play, her voice steady but laced with fatigue. Day 21. The island reveals more of its secrets, but also its dangers. We find evidence of previous inhabitants, lost peoples whose stories were swallowed by time and tide. The question remains, Can we uncover the truth without becoming part of this erasure? Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the stars and dimming the moon's pale glow. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whisper, a language lost to all but the island, trailed through the night air, a chilling reminder that some histories refuse to be forgotten. Yet, as the team grappled with these revelations, fractures deepened. Marcus's impatience clashed with Lena's cautious rituals. Ortiz's skepticism collided with Evelyn's desperate hope. The island's silence grew heavier, pressing in on their minds, threatening to unravel the fragile threads that bound them together. The relics were more than artifacts. They were fragments of a past that refused to die, echoes of lives erased but not extinguished. Each discovery was a step deeper into the island's heart and closer to the edge of oblivion. The scientists faced a choice: to hold fast to reason or surrender to the creeping terror that sought to dissolve their very selves. As midnight approached, the island seemed to pulse with a quiet hunger. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of salt and decay, and the faintest murmur of voices long silenced. In that moment, the island was no longer just a place. It was a living testament to forgetting, a silent sentinel guarding its forgotten names. And the team's fate, like those before them, hung precariously in the balance between memory and oblivion. The night deepened, and with it, the questions grew louder. How much could they remember before they too became fragments of the past? How long before the island claimed them, erasing their names from the world as if they had never existed at all? In the shadows, the island waited, patient and eternal. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the beach, the coarse sand cold beneath her boots, her breath visible in the chill air. The oppressive silence was unlike anything she had ever encountered, as though the island itself absorbed every sound before it could reach her ears. Then, from the swirling mists, shapes began to emerge, ghostly outlines that flickered at the periphery of her vision. Silhouettes formed like half-remembered shadows, shifting and wavering between the tangible and the spectral. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of dread and fascination rooting her in place. Behind her, the rest of the team gathered with cautious urgency. Captain Jonas Reed, his face weather-beaten and lined with the experience of decades at sea, scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes. Dr. Marcus Lynn's usual bravado was replaced by a tense stillness, his worn leather jacket pulled tight against the damp cold. Lena Carr clutched a small notebook, her pale fingers trembling as she whispered fragmented words from a language long lost to time. Dr. Samuel Ortiz stood apart, arms crossed, skepticism etched into his thin features, but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "What are they?" Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she focused on the figures shifting, fleeting, as if the island itself breathed them into existence. They were not quite human, nor fully intangible, caught between states like memories half-remembered. The realization settled cold in her gut. These were echoes, remnants of those who had come before, swallowed by the island's relentless tide of oblivion. Later, in the solitude of her tent, Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened the worn, leather-bound journal of her mentor, Dr. Anne Carraway. The pages were yellowed with age, ink faded but still legible. Her mentor's handwriting traced the margins, filled with notes on strange phenomena, eerily reminiscent of their own ordeal. Memories surged Unbiddenen's disappearance on a remote expedition, the whispered warnings she left behind, the guilt that had driven Evelyn to push boundaries. "You warned me," Evelyn whispered to the empty room, her voice thick with sorrow. "But I had to know. I had to understand. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling even the faintest sounds. Captain Reed's voice cut through the quiet as he approached, firm but laced with concern. "Evelyn, this place is changing us. We need to be careful. We can't lose ourselves out here." She met his gaze, nodding slowly. "I know, but giving up means letting the island win. We have to hold onto memories, two names, to each other." At the water's edge, Lena knelt, her voice a fragile thread weaving through the silence. She spoke in the lost language she had uncovered, hoping to anchor the fleeting shadows with names and meaning. The silhouettes paused, almost listening, before dissolving back into the mist. The island was alive, not merely a place, but a force that devoured identity and memory, manifesting its hunger through these ghostly forms. The team's fear deepened, but so too did a fragile hope. If naming these shadows could slow the erasure, perhaps there was a way to resist the silence. Yet the cost was clearage. Moments spent on the island tightened its grip, pulling them closer to oblivion. As night fell, the fog did not lift. Instead, it pressed closer, thickening around their camp like a living shroud. Evelyn sat by the flickering lantern light, clutching her mentor's journal, the words a lifeline and a curse. Outside, the shadows stirred once more, waiting, watching. The island had whispered its warnings. Now, it demanded reckoning. But as the morning sun climbed higher, a subtle shift in the air prickled the skin of the expedition team. A warning unspoken yet deeply felt. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood near the water's edge, her eyes scanning the horizon where the sea met the island's jagged shore. The tides, which had always been a slow, rhythmic pulse, now surged with an unnatural aggression. Waves crashed higher, their frothing crests swallowing the rocks and sand with a hunger that unsettled even the most seasoned among them. "We need to secure the camp," Evelyn called out, her voice cutting through the growing silence that seemed to smother the usual ambient sounds of waves and wind. The team scrambled, their movements frantic as they gathered equipment, tied down tents, and barricaded entrances. Captain Jonas Reed barked orders to the crew, his rugged face tight with concern. The sea was no longer just a backdrop, was an adversary. Marcus Lynn, ever restless and driven by curiosity, lingered at the edge of the camp, his gaze drawn to a fissure in the ground that had appeared overnight. The island's terrain was shifting beneath their feet, unstable and alien. Without waiting for permission, Marcus ventured closer, his worn leather jacket flapping against the rising wind. He knelt by the edge of the fissure, inspecting the cracked earth and the strange, brackish water pooling within. "Marcus, be careful," Lena Carr called softly, her pale face obscured partially by strands of light hair. Her voice was tinged with anxiety, a reflection of the dread creeping through the team. But Marcus was already moving deeper into the ravine the island had formed, eyes wide with a mixture of scientific zeal and reckless abandon. Suddenly, the ground beneath him crumbled a sharp, unnatural fracture and he tumbled backward, plunging into the cold, murky water below. The tide, swelling with unnatural speed, began to pour into the crevice, threatening to trap him. "Marcus," Evelyn shouted, dropping her clipboard as she rushed forward. The roar of the tide mingled with the pounding of her heart, the silence around them now a suffocating void that swallowed sound and hope alike. The team formed a frantic line, hands grasping for the struggling figure, pulling him from the water's icy grasp just before the ravine closed behind them. Sputtering and pale, Marcus gasped for breath, his usual bravado replaced by raw terror. The near-fatal encounter was a stark awakening, a brutal reminder that the island was not simply a place to be studied but a living force bent on their erasure. Around them, tents lay half submerged, instruments floated adrift, and the creeping silence pressed in, eroding the edges of their sanity as surely as the rising tide consumed their camp. Evelyn's voice, though strained, carried a fierce resolve. We hold on, we name everything, we remember, we survive. But even as she spoke, the island answered with a whispering wind and the relentless surge of the tide, a reminder that their battle was only beginning. The salt and the silence were closing in, and the team was caught between the two, fighting to anchor themselves in a fading reality. Night fell with a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the distant crash of waves and the ragged breaths of survivors. The island's erasure was no longer a distant threat, it was here, tangible and terrifying, washing away not just their surroundings, but the very essence of who they were. As the camp lay in ruins and the team huddled close, the question echoed through Evelyn's mind: how long before the tide claimed them all? The tide came in that night, relentless and unforgiving, and with it, the chilling realization that the island's silence was not a void, but a force, one that would consume everything, including the memories and names that defined them. The battle for survival had become a battle against oblivion itself. The jagged cliffs that had loomed solid and unyielding the day before now seemed to quiver at the edges of vision, their familiar outlines fuzzing like wet charcoal smeared across a canvas. Evelyn Hart's eyes scanned the horizon with a mixture of fierce determination and exhaustion. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped open her notebook, the pages filled with careful notations and sketches, anchors in a sea of creeping oblivion. We have to keep naming. Lena's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried across the campfire's crackling embers like a fragile chant. She sat cross-legged on the rocky ground, pale fingers tracing invisible symbols in the air. Her light hair fell forward, veiling her face, but her eyes shone with a strange intensity. If we don't, we'll lose ourselves entirely. Around them, the team gathered in wary clusters. Marcus Lynn's leather jacket looked out of place against the island's shifting, spectral landscape. He paced near the shoreline, kicking at the sand, his sharp eyes darting nervously between the water's edge and the dense fog that curled inland like a living thing. "This isn't survival," he muttered, voice rough with frustration. "We're just delaying the inevitable." Evelyn met his gaze steadily. Delaying is better than surrendering. If we don't fight for our names, our memories, the island will erase us without a trace. Captain Jonas Reed stood a little apart, his rugged face illuminated by the firelight. Years at sea had taught him to trust his instincts, but this place confounded logic. The silence here wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence itself, pressing down like a weight on the chest. He folded his arms, watching the scientists with a mixture of skepticism and growing concern. In the center of the camp, Lena began her ritual. She whispered the names of the island's features: the Saltstone Ridge, the Whispering Grove, the Tide's Reach. Each word was a thread woven against the fabric of erasure. Then she named each person softly but firmly: Evelyn, Marcus, Jonas, Samuel, Mira, Eli, Nia. The effect was subtle but undeniable. For a few fleeting moments, the oppressive silence seemed to waver, as if the act of naming summoned a flicker of presence back into the world. Evelyn's fingers tightened on her pen, committing each name to paper, her voice lowering into a steady cadence as she repeated the cycle. "We're fighting with words," she said, voice hoarse but resolute. "If the island wants to erase us, we'll resist by remembering." Dr. Samuel Ortiz leaned forward, glasses catching the firelight. His usual cynicism was tempered now by exhaustion and fear. "It's a fragile defense," he warned. "The mind can only hold on for so long when the reality around it shifts like sand. Myra Chen nodded, her gaze flickering toward the strange bioluminescent algae that glowed faintly in the tide pools. The island's ecosystem is unlike anything we've seen. It's as if life itself here is entwined with forgetting. Eli Turner checked their equipment again, static crackling through the radio despite the silence. Communications are patchy. If this keeps up, we might lose contact with the outside world entirely. The team's fragile hope was tested as they moved through the day. Landmarks shifted unpredictably, trees that had stood firm vanished only to reappear elsewhere. Footprints in the sand were swallowed by tides that behaved with unnatural intent. Each time Lena named the features, the landscape seemed to stabilize, if only briefly. Marcus's restless energy became more apparent. During a survey along the beach, he challenged Evelyn's cautious approach, his voice rising in frustration. "We can't just sit here whispering names. We need to push forward, map the island, find its source." Evelyn's reply was calm but firm. "Every step forward risks losing more of ourselves. Without anchors, we'll drift into nothing." Their argument left a fissure in the group's unity. Some sided with Marcus's urgency. Others clung to Evelyn's methodical resistance. The island's silence deepened, swallowing their voices and fraying their connections. As dusk fell, the campfire became a fragile hearth against the encroaching darkness. Captain Reed's steady presence offered a semblance of order, but even he felt the island's pull. The silence was no longer just external, it seeped into their minds, threatening to undo the very fabric of who they were. Lena's whispered naming continued into the night, a litany against oblivion. Evelyn recorded every name, every detail, her handwriting growing erratic but determined. "We are here," she murmured to herself. "We exist." Yet, as the stars blinked coldly overhead, the island waited, patient and eternal, its tides poised to reclaim all that dared to remember. The struggle was far from over, and somewhere in the silence, the island listened. End of. Within the dim confines of the common area, the team gathered, but the usual hum of scientific discussion had been replaced by a strained quiet. Words hesitated on the edges of lips, as if the silence itself was a living force, pressing in and smothering their voices before they could fully form. Evelyn Hart sat at the worn wooden table, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the rim of her metal cup. Her sharp eyes scanned the faces around her, faces marked by exhaustion, confusion, and a creeping blankness that no amount of reason could dispel. She tried to speak, to rally the group with a few carefully chosen words, but the sentences faltered, dissolving into uneasy murmurs. The island's silence was not just an absence of sound. It had become a palpable weight, thickening the air and fraying the fragile threads that held the team together. Across the room, Captain Jonas Reed stood near the entrance, his weather-beaten face set in a hard line. Years at sea had taught him to read the subtle signs of a crew on edge, and his instincts screamed that this was no ordinary fear. He moved deliberately, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor as he approached Evelyn. "We need order," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We can't let this place get inside our heads." Evelyn nodded, though the knot of doubt tightened in her chest. The island's influence was creeping beyond the physical realm, attacking their minds and eroding their very sense of self. The team's cohesion was slipping through their fingers like grains of salt lost to the tide. Meanwhile, in the makeshift laboratory, Dr. Samuel Ortiz sat hunched over a cluttered desk. His pale fingers clutched a pen as he scribbled notes in a shaky hand. The skepticism that had once grounded him was unraveling, replaced by a gnawing despair. The scientific rigor he championed now felt like a fragile shield against an overwhelming void. His glasses slipped down his nose as fragmented thoughts scattered through his mind, each more elusive than the last. It's all slipping away," he muttered to himself, eyes darting to the window where shadows danced with the flickering light. The silence outside was no longer neutral. It was accusatory, a reminder of their impending erasure. Back near the camp's edge, Mira, Chen, and Eli Turner exchanged anxious glances. Myra's dark hair was pulled tight into a bun, her eyes sharp despite the weariness. Eli, with his tousled blonde hair and grease-stained shirt, shifted uneasily beside her. Strange noises had begun to echo faintly from the dense trees, a whispering rustle that defied explanation. "Did you hear that?" Myra whispered, her voice barely audible. Eli nodded, swallowing hard. "It's like the island itself is breathing, watching us, waiting." Their shared fear forged a fragile bond, a tenuous tether in the face of the encroaching silence. Yet even this connection felt threatened by the island's relentless tide of oblivion. As the hours crawled by, the team's interactions grew more disjointed. Conversations were punctuated by long pauses, eyes avoiding contact, words left unsaid. The island's oppressive quiet was fracturing their relationships, turning allies into strangers and friends into phantoms of memory. Captain Reed's attempts to impose discipline met with resistance. Exhaustion and fear had eroded the authority he once commanded. Dr. Ortiz's despair became contagious, seeping into the group like a slow poison. Evelyn struggled to hold on to her leadership role, her analytical mind battling the chaos that threatened to consume them all. Amid the unraveling bonds, the island loomed like a spectrate's shifting terrain and creeping silence, a constant reminder that their ordeal was far from over. The very act of communication, once their greatest strength, had become their greatest vulnerability. In whispered tones and fragmented thoughts, the team clung to the fragile hope that naming, speaking, and remembering might anchor them to reality. But as the night deepened, the question lingered in the stale air. How long could they resist the tide before they too were swept away, forgotten, silent, lost? Evelyn's gaze flicked to the fading horizon beyond the camp, where the restless sea mirrored the turmoil within. The island's silence was no longer just a phenomenon to be studied. It was a predator, stalking their minds and hunting their souls. And the fraying connections among the team were the first casualties. The night pressed on, thick with dread and uncertainty. Somewhere in the shadows, the island whispered its ancient, forgotten names they could barely recall, and soon might never remember at all. But even as the darkness threatened to consume them, a spark of defiance flickered within Evelyn's heart. She would not let the silence win, not without a fight. The fragile threads of memory and trust might be unraveling, but she would cling to them with every breath. "We have to stay together," she murmured, voice steady despite the storm inside. "No matter what this place does, we hold on to each other." A fragile promise in a world unraveling, but for now, it was all they had. And as the island's tide of oblivion lapped ever closer, the battle for their very souls began anew.